On May 7, 2026, on the same morning, two pieces of news appeared in parallel on global news bulletins. The first, Iran had just submitted a 14-point peace proposal through Pakistan, an official diplomatic document, with each clause numbered, passed through Islamabad's confidential diplomatic channels. The second, appearing almost simultaneously, General Muhammad Jafar Assadi, a high-ranking commander of Iran's Central Military Command, stated bluntly to Fars news agency that a new conflict with the U.S. was highly likely and Iran was fully prepared for it. The same government. The same morning, two completely opposing messages. But that was not all, because that same week, while Iranian diplomats were sitting at the negotiating table in Islamabad, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, was launching 15 ballistic missiles at the UAE, setting fire to the Fujairah oil port, attacking a South Korean commercial ship in the Strait of Hormuz, and directly confronting the U.S. Navy in Operation Project Freedom. President Pezeshkian, the head of Iran's government, called those attacks completely irresponsible and affirmed that he had not been informed in advance. Most news outlets read all of this as a deliberate two-faced tactic, Iran negotiating while threatening, offering an olive branch while raising a fist, but that is the wrong reading, completely wrong. Because if you understand what had actually happened inside Tehran since February 28th, the day Ali Khamenei was eliminated, the day the power structure Iran had operated for 4 decades collapsed in just a few hours, you would understand that this is not a deliberate contradiction. This is a symptom of a government that is no longer a unified entity, where at least 3 power centers are pulling in 3 completely different directions with no one having enough authority to hold them back. And no one outside Tehran, not even Washington, knows for sure who is really in control. That, not the number of missiles, not naval power, not any negotiations taking place in Islamabad or Beijing, is the real factor determining whether this ceasefire will hold or not. And in this video, I will explain exactly why. Stay until the end of the video. To understand why this ceasefire is standing on a knife's edge, you have to start from February 28, not from the negotiations in Islamabad, not from Trump's statements, but from the moment when everything changed, the first day of Operation Epic Fury, the day Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader for more than 3 decades, the architect of the entire Islamic Republic power structure, was eliminated in U.S. and Israeli airstrikes, along with a series of other senior regime leaders within the first few hours of the war. To replace him, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, installed Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the slain leader, as the nominal supreme leader within a few weeks, a move that analysts described as the IRGC giving itself a more legal stamp rather than actually seeking a leader. Because Mojtaba Khamenei, since being installed, has not appeared in public once. No images, no recordings, no speeches, only texts issued in his name from a secret location known to only a few people in the IRGC, while rumors of his actual death spread widely in Iranian society, to the point that Israel publicly declared they might soon target him. A statement as notable for what it implied about what Israel knew regarding his real condition. In that power vacuum, the IRGC did not waste a second. General Ahmed Vahidi, the IRGC commander-in-chief, built a security cordon around Mojtaba, completely controlling the flow of information in and out of the nominal leader, and began operating a military council of senior IRGC officers as a shadow government, making military, security, and even diplomatic decisions without notifying any civilian agencies. President Masoud Pezeshkian, the head of Iran's legally elected government, had repeatedly requested urgent meetings with Mojtaba Khamenei and repeatedly received no response, not because the leader did not want to meet, but because the IRGC was deliberately blocking that access, isolating Mojtaba from the civilian government to ensure that every decision had to go through Vahidi's filter first. And alongside Vahidi, the power picture became even more complex, with the faction of Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Parliament, more pragmatic and more willing to negotiate, but also being gradually sidelined by Vahidi, while Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, who was directly at the negotiating table with mediators, had been reprimanded by the IRGC itself for exceeding authority by showing too much flexibility in previous negotiations, a small but significant detail, because it meant that even Iranian diplomats at the negotiating table were not sure how far they were allowed to concede before being recalled by the IRGC. The consequences of all that become very clear when you know where to look. While Iranian diplomats were submitting the 14-point proposal in Islamabad, the IRGC was launching missiles at the UAE without informing the president, and Pezeshkian, instead of staying silent as per regime custom, publicly described those attacks as completely irresponsible and without coordination with the government, a public disagreement so rare that it had never occurred in this form in the history of the Islamic Republic. This is where understanding Iran's power structure becomes more important than any news report. Before the war, Iran's system operated according to a clear hierarchy, the supreme leader at the top, the IRGC below, the civilian government further below, and that system worked not because it was efficient, but because every faction knew who the final arbiter was in case of disagreement. No one dared cross that line, because the consequences were real and immediate. When Ali Khamenei was eliminated, that arbiter disappeared, and there was no mechanism in Iran's system designed to replace that function under war conditions, because the system was built on the assumption that the supreme leader would always be there. What emerged instead was not a new power center, but three centers pulling in three completely different directions at the same time. Vahidi wanted to continue confrontation because that was the only language he knew, and because the war was strengthening the IRGC's power domestically. Ghalibaf wanted conditional negotiations because he understood that the Iranian economy was collapsing and the regime could not survive long under these conditions. And Pezeshkian was being completely sidelined from all real decisions, even though he was still president in name, and none of the three was strong enough to force the other two to stop. That is the direct reason why Iran submitted a peace proposal and attacked ships in Hormuz in the same week. Not a deliberate two-faced tactic, but two factions actually doing two completely different things, with none of them able to control the others. And one final sign that should not be overlooked: reports that Iran is massacring those suspected of dissent internally are not the actions of a regime that is winning or even stable. Those are the actions of a regime that is more afraid of its own people than its external enemies, seeing cracks starting to spread from within and trying to patch them with violence instead of with authority. Because real authority, the kind Ali Khamenei once possessed, is no longer there. Trump read this more clearly than any commentator. He said, "They get close, and then a new group of people come in. They don't know who their leaders are." Not mockery, but the most accurate strategic assessment Washington has publicly made about Tehran's internal situation since the beginning of the crisis. Now let's talk about the 14-point proposal, the diplomatic document that Iran submitted through Pakistan on May 20, and the document that Trump rejected almost immediately upon receiving it. On the surface, this is a peace proposal. Iran demands a complete end to the war within 30 days, instead of accepting the 2-month ceasefire framework that Washington had set, while rejecting zero enrichment, that is, refusing to completely abandon its uranium enrichment program, refusing any limits on its ballistic missile program, and demanding binding guarantees from both the US and Israel that there will be no future attacks on Iran. Trump, facing that document, declared himself unsatisfied and stated bluntly that he was considering further military options, along with the remark we mentioned earlier that Iran doesn't know who their leaders are. Most commentators read this event as a routine diplomatic failure. Two sides negotiate, no result is reached, proceed to the next round. But that reading misses the most important thing about this 14-point document, and the most important thing is not in its content, but in its structure. Because when you read each point carefully, rejection of zero enrichment, rejection of missile limits, demand for no attack guarantees, you are not reading a list of terms Iran wants to negotiate. You are reading the exact list of things that Washington cannot accept without completely undermining the entire reason for Operation Epic Fury, because the declared goal of that campaign from the first day was to ensure Iran never acquires nuclear weapons and no longer has missile capabilities threatening the region. If Washington signs a document allowing Iran to keep its uranium enrichment program and its ballistic missile arsenal intact, the entire campaign becomes strategically meaningless. Iran knows that. Washington knows that. And here is what is important. Pakistan, the mediating intermediary sitting between the two sides, also knows that, but still forwards the document, still declares optimism, still affirms it is in continuous day and night contact with both sides, because Pakistan's role is not to guarantee a successful deal, but to guarantee that the communication channel is not cut. And that communication channel has value independent of whether the content passing through it is feasible or not. The real question about the 14-point proposal is not why Trump rejected it. That question already has a clear answer. The real question is, who inside Tehran drafted this document, and what was their purpose in drafting it? And this is where the fragmented power picture we just discussed becomes directly relevant. If the 14-point document was drafted by the IRGC faction, professional diplomats who understand the rules of international play, who know that rigid diplomatic language on the surface sometimes hides real negotiating space underneath, then there could be a real pathway hidden behind those unacceptable terms, a pathway that the two sides could gradually move toward through subsequent rounds of talks. But if the document was drafted by the Vahidi faction, those who see negotiations not as an exit ramp, but as a tool to buy time to reposition weapons and consolidate positions before hostilities resume, then this is pure propaganda document designed to allow Iran to demonstrate goodwill before international public opinion, while in reality having no intention of conceding anything of substantive significance. And the fact that IRGC was reprimanded by the IRGC itself for exceeding authority and being too flexible in previous negotiation rounds, that is, punished for doing exactly the job of a diplomat, says a great deal about who is really controlling the content of what Iran brings to the negotiating table. The nuclear dispute unfolding in parallel with all this adds further complexity to the picture. Trump publicly stated that Iran had agreed to no uranium enrichment, a statement that the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization completely denied immediately afterward, two directly contradictory statements that cannot both be true, issued from two sides within a few hours, and no one can verify which side is telling the truth, because the entire negotiation process is taking place in the shadows of confidential diplomatic channels. The US wants a 20-year commitment, Iran offers 5 years. That gap is not just a number. It reflects two completely different views on the nature of the agreement. Washington wants a long-term structural change. Tehran wants a short pause, sufficient to recover. Meanwhile, Axios reported that the White House is close to approaching a one-page memorandum that could lay the groundwork for a 30-day agreement. A notable signal because it shows Washington is not completely shutting the door, that someone somewhere in the Iranian system is saying things specific enough for the White House to believe a concise document could be feasible. And Foreign Minister Araghchi's flight to Beijing on May 6 to meet Foreign Minister Wang Yi, with China confirming its role in ceasefire negotiations, is the final piece in this picture. Iran is trying to open another pressure channel, bringing China in as a counterweight to Pakistan, as a way of telling Washington that if the US continues to refuse, then there are other players on this board with an interest in keeping Iran alive as an economic partner. And Beijing, the country just warned by the US about continuing to buy Iranian oil, has its own reasons for wanting this war to end in a way that is not too unfavorable to Tehran. But while all those negotiations are taking place, there is an entirely different war in the Strait of Hormuz, a simpler and more brutal weapon: economic blockade. Since April 13th, the U.S. Navy has deployed a blockade ring around Iran's ports, stopping 45 ships as of May 7th, while around 2,000 commercial vessels from around the world are stuck at both ends of the strait, unable to move, unable to deliver cargo, unable to make money, and every day they continue to sit idle is another day of accumulating pressure not only on Iran, but on the entire global economy, on oil prices, on energy supply chains in Asia and Europe, and on America's own allies, who are beginning to view the cost of this strategic patience differently from Washington. On May 4th, Trump escalated another level by announcing Operation Project Freedom, a campaign to escort commercial ships through Hormuz with guided missile destroyers, more than 100 aircraft of various types, and multi-domain unmanned platforms, described by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth as defensive in nature, limited in scope, temporary in duration, with a single mission: to protect innocent commercial shipping from Iranian aggression. The first day of Project Freedom immediately showed why this is one of the most complex decisions Washington has made since the beginning of the crisis. Only 2 U.S. ships made it through successfully, while the IRGC attacked the South Korean container ship HMM Namu, right in the strait, launched missiles and drones at the UAE, and deployed high-speed small boats to harass the route, forcing the U.S. to destroy 6 to 7 IRGC boats in the strait, an action that both sides afterward described in completely different ways, with Iran claiming the boats were carrying civilians and the U.S. completely denying it. But the peak of that week was not what happened in Hormuz, but what happened in the UAE, dozens of kilometers away from the strait. On May 4th, Iran launched 15 ballistic missiles targeting UAE territory, the largest attack since the ceasefire took effect on April 8, and the boldest escalation the IRGC has carried out since the beginning of the war. The UAE activated THAAD and Patriot systems, shooting down all 15 ballistic missiles, but the drones were not completely stopped, and one drone penetrated that defensive layer to strike the Fujairah oil port, causing a large fire at the oil and gas industrial zone, injuring 3 Indian citizens, and forcing the UAE Ministry of Education to close all schools nationwide and switch to online learning until the end of the week, a decision affecting millions of students across the 7 Emirates. On May 5, the IRGC attacked the UAE a second time, and this time Pezeshkian did not stay silent. He publicly expressed strong anger toward General Vahidi, describing the attacks as completely irresponsible and carried out without the government having any prior knowledge, a statement that Defense Secretary Hegseth later confirmed from the U.S. side when he said that there are actions that the IRGC sometimes takes that are outside the scope of what Iranian negotiators want, and that it was up to them to restrain that. Now understand why all these events, when placed next to each other, reveal a much clearer strategic logic than what appears on the surface. Project Freedom is not a conventional military campaign. Trump did not need to reopen Hormuz on May 4. He did not need a victory that day. And the fact that the campaign only got 2 ships through on the first day is not a failure but a deliberate signal. A signal that the U.S. has sufficient resolve and sufficient capability to do this whenever Washington chooses, that Iran can no longer consider Hormuz inviolable, and that with each additional day the blockade continues. The diplomatic and economic price only increases rather than decreases, and Trump's suspension of Project Freedom on May 6 with the reason major progress in negotiations perfectly completes that logic. He escalates, applies maximum pressure, then pauses at the right moment to give the negotiating faction inside Iran, the Iraqi faction, the Ghalibaf faction, those who want to exit this war, a window to operate. And the IRGC's attack on the UAE's Fujairah oil port reveals a strategic vulnerability that Vahidi may not have wanted to expose. Fujairah is not a random target. It is the only alternative oil export route that can completely bypass Hormuz, handling about 1.7 million barrels of oil per day through a pipeline from Abu Dhabi to the Gulf of Oman. If the IRGC needed to attack Fujairah, that means they know that the Hormuz blockade alone is no longer sufficient to inflict the necessary level of global economic pain, and they need to expand the battlefield beyond the strait to maintain negotiating leverage. That is a sign of strategic desperation, not strength. Meanwhile, the U.S. continues to tighten on another front by publicly accusing China of financing Iran through continued oil purchases, pushing a resolution at the UN Security Council to legally bind Iran internationally regarding Hormuz, and maintaining more than 50,000 troops in the region with the presence of the 82nd Airborne Division as an unmistakable signal that Washington has no intention of withdrawing no matter what stage the negotiations are in. And that is reinforced by the official notification sent to Congress under the War Powers Resolution that hostilities have ceased, a legal move that few noticed but with clear implications. If hostilities resume, the Trump administration does not need to return to Congress to seek permission to act. But while all those negotiations and surface confrontations are taking place, there is a third story happening in the shadows, a story that the news bulletins are not following, but which may be the most decisive factor for what happens next. That story is what Iran is doing with its remaining arsenal during this ceasefire period. And to understand it, you have to start with the numbers. Operation Epic Fury destroyed about 80% of Iran's missile capabilities, a figure that Western military analysts describe as a disaster for any armed force. But that figure also means 20% remains. And when you are talking about one of the largest missile arsenals in the Middle East, that 20% is still a significant amount, not to mention that some independent assessments suggest the actual surviving figure could be as high as 50% thanks to hundreds of kilometers of tunnels and deep underground bunkers beneath the mountain ranges that Operation Epic Fury, even using heavy bunker buster bombs from B-2s, could not fully penetrate. And right now, during this ceasefire period, Iran is doing everything it can to optimize that remaining portion. IRGC engineering teams are working day and night to dig out, salvage missiles, ammunition, and launchers from under the rubble of the underground missile cities, those gigantic missile storage and launch facilities built inside mountains over decades, many of which were heavily damaged by US and Israeli airstrikes, but not completely destroyed, and anything still movable is being pulled out, inspected, and redistributed to new positions that the US does not yet have coordinates for. In that redistribution priority list, the most prominent are the solid-fuel ballistic missiles, Sejil, Karamshar, the Imad series, and the reason Iran is prioritizing them is not random. Solid-fuel missiles do not need fueling time before launch, can be deployed on continuously moving mobile launchers, and do not require any fixed infrastructure as targets for follow-on airstrikes. Especially important in the context that Iran knows the US is tracking every fixed site from satellites and is ready to strike as soon as the ceasefire ends. In parallel, the Fatah series missiles, high-precision short-range missiles designed for area saturation, that is, saturating a target area with large numbers of precise warheads to overwhelm point defense systems, are being concentrated at new positions, while the Khalij Fars and Noor anti-ship weapons are being repositioned around coastal sites near the Strait of Hormuz, aimed at the scenario Iran considers most likely if hostilities resume: a direct naval confrontation in the strait, where the IRGC believes high-speed anti-ship missiles can inflict sufficient damage. The Shahed-136 drones, the cheap kamikaze weapons that Iran developed, sold to Russia, and then saw the US reverse engineer into Lucas, are being prioritized for large-scale redeployment around the Hormuz area and toward America's Gulf partners, and the fact that Iran has already deployed them against the UAE on May 4 and 5, with one drone penetrating THAAD and Patriot systems to strike Fujairah, shows this is not potential capability, but combat-proven capacity. On the intelligence side, Iran is actively seeking targeting data from China, precise location information on US and allied military assets in the region that Iran's intelligence system no longer has the independent capability to collect after most of its radar and satellite network was destroyed in Operation Epic Fury. And this is why Arakchi's trip to Beijing is not purely diplomatic. At the same time, reports indicate Iran is converting many civilian factories, manufacturing workshops, warehouses, even agricultural facilities, into temporary weapons production sites, an effort that cannot replace the destroyed defense industrial base, but can sustain a trickle of production sufficient to replenish drone and ammunition stocks. And all of that is protected by a decision that is militarily understandable, but ethically and legally under international law extremely serious. Iran is hiding weapons in hospitals, universities, museums, civilian facilities protected under international law, not because there are no other options, but because this is a calculated warfighting doctrine designed to put the US in an unwinnable situation. If Washington strikes those positions, propaganda images will pour down like a waterfall. If Washington does not strike, Iran can launch from there without being destroyed. The final layer of this shadow strategy is GPS jamming and AIS spoofing in the Hormuz area, which has intensified sharply after the UAE attacks, with maritime intelligence companies recording waves of commercial ships turning off transponders and reporting severe positioning signal interference, because if Iran cannot stop the US from escorting ships by direct force, then at least they can make the maritime environment dangerous enough, unpredictable enough, risky enough in terms of insurance, that major shipping companies will continue to refuse sending vessels into the strait, even with the U.S. Navy present, because real control of Hormuz does not need to be physical control, it only needs to be perceptual control, risk control in the minds of ship captains and shipping company executives sitting in London, Singapore, and Tokyo who are looking at maps and wondering whether this voyage is worth it. So let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture. Because when you put all those pieces together, the structure of this conflict becomes clear. The U.S. is fighting this war with time and economics. A naval blockade tightening Iran's oil revenue day by day, 50,000 troops present in the region with the 82nd Airborne Division ready. The War Powers Resolution already notified to remove legal constraints if action is needed again, and Project Freedom ready to reactivate at any moment as a lever that can be deployed within hours, all combining to form a long-term pressure strategy that Washington has the resources to sustain almost indefinitely. Iran, for its part, is fighting with a completely different weapon, not strength but instability, not overwhelming but causing enough pain to make the world tired. Blocking Hormuz keeps oil prices high. Attacking the UAE spreads geopolitical fear beyond Iran's borders. GPS jamming and AIS spoofing maintain a risky environment that prevents commercial shipping flows from fully recovering, even with Project Freedom. This is the structure of a pure war of wills, and in this kind of war, the question is never who has more weapons, because the answer to that question has been clear since February 28. The only question that matters is which side blinks first, and who inside each side has the authority to make that decision. On the U.S. side, the answer is simple: Trump decides, and the military machine executes. On the Iran side, that answer is more complicated than at any point in the history of the Islamic Republic, and that very complexity is the most dangerous variable in the entire equation. The variable that decides everything is not the number of Sejal missiles left in the mountain bunkers, not how many U.S. ships can escort through Hormuz each day, but Mojtaba Khamenei, the man hiding at a secret location, appearing only through texts, whom even the president of the government he nominally leads cannot access, and whose rumored death is spreading widely enough for Israel to publicly threaten to target him. If Mojtaba is still alive, still conscious, and able to impose his will on Vahidi, then a door for a deal remains open, because even in Iran's current fractured system, the signature of the supreme leader is still the only thing that can legitimize a major concession in the eyes of all domestic factions. If Mojtaba is a complete puppet in Vahidi's hands, or worse, if he is no longer there in any substantive sense, then there is no mechanism in Iran's current system for a real agreement to be signed and respected, because Vahidi has no incentive to concede when the war is strengthening the IRGC's domestic power more than any election or political reform ever could. There are two paths ahead, and both depend on that variable. The first path, Vahidi calculates that continuing hurts more than conceding. Iran's economy continues to collapse. The blockade continues to tighten. Internal pressure from the Iranian people continues to build, to the point that even the IRGC realizes a regime that cannot feed its own people will not survive long enough to enjoy military victory. And in that situation, the one-page memorandum that Axios reported the White House is approaching could emerge within 30 days. With Arakchi's visit to Beijing to meet Wang Yi on May 6 as the most positive signal of the week that a substantive channel is being maintained. The second path, the IRGC continues attacking U.S. ships or allied assets. Trump loses patience, and the U.S. military response this time will not resemble Operation Epic Fury. It will be more surgical, faster, and specifically designed to destroy precisely what Iran has spent the ceasefire period rebuilding. F-22s with APG-77 radar scanning for mobile missile launchers before they can deploy. F-16 CJ Wild Weasels flying ahead to destroy remaining radars and surface-to-air missile systems with high-speed anti-radiation missiles in SEAD missions. F-35s transmitting real-time targeting data to the entire force. F-15Es carrying out precision strikes on each identified target, Dark Eagle hypersonic weapons destroying fixed launch sites before Iran can fire the first salvo, and high-power microwave weapons to neutralize Shahed drone swarms before they get close enough to cause harm, an attack architecture designed not to defeat Iran, but to precisely eliminate the remaining counterattack capability that Iran has spent the entire ceasefire period assembling. The question is whether Iran reaches that point of exhaustion before or after the IRGC crosses the threshold that Trump is willing to tolerate. And that is a question no one in Washington, no one in Tehran, and certainly no one sitting reading daily news bulletins can answer with complete certainty at this moment. And that brings us to the biggest strategic observation of this entire conflict. For the first time in modern history, Iran is facing an existential crisis without a real leader at the top. Not in the sense that no one occupies the position nominally, but in the sense that the person in that position does not have enough substantive authority to make the biggest decisions, and those who do have real authority do not have enough legitimacy to make those decisions respected by all domestic factions. Every major decision must pass through a fractured apparatus where no one has enough authority to say enough, and no one has enough authority to say continue, in a way that all remaining factions will obey. This ceasefire is unlike any ceasefire in modern Middle East history, not because the two sides are negotiating, but because one of the two sides does not know who is really negotiating on their behalf, does not know which commitments made at the negotiating table will actually be respected by those holding the guns, and does not know whether the person signing any final agreement has enough power to force the IRGC to comply. That is why what happens in the coming weeks will not only determine Iran's future, it could reshape the entire power structure of the Middle East in ways no one, not even Washington, can fully predict. If you want to continue following these developments with real analytical depth, not surface news, not bulletins that only recount what happened without explaining why, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We will continue tracking every development of this conflict as it continues to unfold.